When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Mye Kaloustian. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Greg, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish. And welcome to this episode of the podcast, Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. This episode, Greg and I are very excited to have our dear friend and published poet, Leslie Ross-Degnan, coming to help us look at and review another book whose theme is oldishness. Today, we're looking at Travels with Charley by John Steinbeck, a classic. So, Leslie, do you want to lead off our discussion? And then Greg and I will just jump in.
Sure, that sounds great. Yeah, so John Steinbeck's Travels with Charley in Search of America. That's probably a book a lot of people have already read in middle school or high school. So if you didn't get a chance to reread it, you'll be reminded of the themes in this book. So Steinbeck is, one of our most notable American writers. He was born in the early 20th century in 1902. He died rather young at about age 66 in New York City after the flu pandemic. Most of us know what a celebrated writer John Steinbeck was and recognize many of his novels, such as Grapes of Wrath, for which he won a Pulitzer Prize in 1940, and among one of his most widely read novels. And of course, Of Mice and Men, East of Eden, The Red Pony, Cannery Row, The Pearl, The Log from the Sea of Cortez. We all have heard of those, probably read many of those. And his last novel, The Winter of Our Discontent. Steinbeck wrote many other lesser-known works of fiction, nonfiction, short stories, plays. He even wrote some screenplays. He was very prolific. And in 1962, he won the Nobel Prize for his entire body of work. So this book that we're discussing today was written in 1962. You might want to ask, was John Steinbeck oldish when he wrote about his trip across America? Probably not by current standards, because he was only 58. But in 1962, Steinbeck was near the end of his career and not that far from the end of his life. He was only 66 when he died. So maybe it's safe to say that oldish was probably defined a little bit differently back in the 60s than it is today in 2023. What do you guys think about that? I mean, that was my thought about it. Thinking that he's not really oldish, but by our standards. But
it's an interesting point. We've talked about that when we first started the podcast of, what defines oldish. And Greg has in the introduction, if you're feeling oldish, you're probably oldish. But if you think about some facts like AARP, you can join that when you're 55, I think. And even some housing communities for the elderly or older people, I think that starts sometimes at 55 or 60. So I think maybe the combination of his time that, that time in life that people didn't live quite as long as they do now. And, so that he would be oldish from those standards. And then also a little bit from ours, because ours are so broad, 55 and up or 50 and up. I don't even know with AARP if it's 50 or 55.
Yeah, I don't either. I refuse to join because then I would feel like I was old. I think of it as the physiological age and mental age has changed since then. You know, we're talking about 60 plus years ago. So things have changed. You know, life expectancies have gone up, health outcomes have improved. And there, you know, there's a common expression that has various forms, but I think in this context, we could say 70 is the new 60, right? So people who are 70 years old now are the approximate equivalent of people who were 60 back in the day. So if you do that, then, and we're calling ourselves oldish at around 70, he was around 60 when he did his trip and wrote his book. So I think we can say that he was around the same age as we are now. And one thing I think of for sure is that he felt like he was doing the last big trip of his life, and he was seeing it as a culmination of sorts. And he wanted to go and see America one last time and to get a sense of it one last time. And he launched himself in what was in 1960, I think, a really creative way to do it. He went out and bought a pickup truck and had somebody build a camper on the back of it. And that was not a common way to travel back in 1960. So there was kind of a bold adventure that he launched off onto with just his dog. And apparently a liquor cabinet and some guns. And so I think that his doing it at all is a symbol of his feeling oldish as opposed to old. You know, if he felt really old, he could have done like some of the other writers his age did and just went and sat with his whiskey and his cigars and, you know, and hope for the best. He was an active, hard living kind of a guy. So I think he qualified as oldish, and I think he thought of himself in that way, in that I ain't old yet. I'm not done yet, which is how we kind of have defined it more than once is, you know, if you look in the mirror and you say, oh no, but then you say, but I'm not done yet, then you're oldish.
Yeah, no, I definitely would agree with that. And when I started to read this book, if you might not remember, but if you even just look at page 1, Steinbeck has some doubt about that, whether he should take this trip or about whether this trip is really going to happen, because he was getting over some kind of illness. And what he said was, you know, I was having one of those carefully named difficulties, which are the whispers of approaching age. And I love that phrase. I mean, we were talking earlier about his writing and how amazing it was. I love this phrase, the whispers of an approaching age. I think it's kind of, you know, a good description of oldish. And it kind of seems to demonstrate Steinbeck's thought of himself as being oldish, like you just said, Greg. But I'd go further in terms of the symbolism about this trip and his oldishness. I mean, I even found myself thinking that the actual physical journey that he was on it's kind of a metaphor for him, for his journey in life towards becoming an older man. You know, it felt as if he was not only on a journey to discover America, but on a journey to discover himself as an aging man. And so I picked up a lot of that attitude and energy as I was reading this, which I never even considered before because I was very youngish when I read this book before. And as an oldish person reading it again, which is why I recommend people read it again, because you're totally different. Your perspective is totally different on it. And so we're picking up all these new things that we hadn't seen or read before or thought about before. You know, so he kind of starts this journey out with all this like new excitement and promise at the thought of beginning a journey. And then he starts to complain pretty early on in the book about being lonely, which I always think is sort of it's an oldish thing, you know, like I need to have company. I don't want to be alone because then I feel kind of old and alone. But, you know, those moments of loneliness start to increase, and pretty soon the luster of this grand adventure dissipates a little bit, and he starts to have more of a desire to get back home, or at least to see his wife again in the middle of the journey home. Did you notice that?
Yeah, he was clear about that at one point when he got to upstate New York after being on the road for several weeks, going up through Maine and across New Hampshire and Vermont, and found himself in upstate New York. And he said, you know what, that's enough of this crap. I'm going to Chicago where my wife is. And he just booked it from upstate New York straight through to Chicago without stopping much. I think he was pretty clear about that. I think he was lonesome and he missed his wife. I think he missed having conversations. You know, that's the thing that happens when you're traveling, is you get to chat with people, but you don't have deep conversations with anybody because you don't know them. You know, even people that you're sitting and, you know, he mentioned several times where he would stop and he would have a drink with people and they would chat a little bit, but he even went fishing with a guy in, I forget where he was, some place in Maine or something. He went fishing with a guy, and you don't get into it deeply when you're sitting and chatting. I think he missed having somebody that knew him well to have that conversation with. And he's a pretty wordy guy, almost by definition, and won a Nobel Prize in literature. So not being able to do words with anybody much. And he mentioned something that I don't know whether it's still true or not, but back in the day, everybody thought that New Englanders were taciturn. The guy in rural Maine, if you get anything out of him at all, would be, yeah. I think he'd had about enough of that. He needed to have somebody to talk to. And I can relate to that. That's kind of oldish.
Yeah, I actually had a few passages marked, and I happened to have this one open, which he says, quote, he put a quote, relationship time to aloneness, end a quote. And then it was from a note that he found. And then he wrote, having a companion fixes you in time and that the present. But when the quality of aloneness settles down, past, present, and future all flow together. A memory, a present event, and a forecast all equally present. And I wondered if he would have been able to think about that as a young person. It feels like an oldish kind of statement. I'm not sure, but I guess to be oldish enough to have a past and a present, and that your future is, you can see the end of it probably.
Yeah, I think that's true, that loneliness is kind of a condition of the oldish population. Yeah. And that, because we've often lost friends, and family, and we're doing it on our own. And so he sort of had this instant experience of doing something like pretty big on his own. And I think he talks a lot about the loneliness of life on the road. And, again, I think that's part of maybe some practice he's doing for, being alone in his life. When you talked about his visit in Chicago with his wife, and I think when he stopped in Chicago to meet her, he was really not eager to return back to his travels because he really enjoyed having company again. And he says, quote again, after the comfort and company of Chicago, I had to learn to be alone again. I had to go through the same lost loneliness all over, no less painful than the first. There seemed to be no cure for loneliness save only being alone. And there was a lot of stuff here about that, I noticed.
Do you think he was surprised? Like, I got the sense that he was setting up this adventure. He got Rocinante, the name of his vehicle, made. He packed it. It just, there was, the very beginning of the book, I felt there was a sense of adventure, and he was going to do this, amazing cross the country by himself and Charley, of course. But I think, like you said, Leslie, pretty quickly, it was like, this is kind of lonely. I'm not sure how I feel about this. And then pretty soon after that was, I don't think I like being lonely.
Yeah, I agree. And then, Greg, you mentioned how, his writing and his power of observation, what most writers have, too, really became, he kicked in, like he was feeling lonely and talking about that. But then he would have these experiences where he'd meet somebody. And, or he had an experience where the one that I thought was really funny that I wanted to mention was about the plastics on everything. I remember that from reading this book like a long time ago, because it was the age of plastics. Plastics were just becoming You were seeing them everywhere, right? It kind of reminded me of that scene from The Graduate. Remember when the Ben, the young guy who's Dustin Hoffman played, is graduating, and his uncle puts his arm around him and says, "Plastics, son. You want to go into plastics. That's the future." And I just had a laugh when he was described staying at a hotel and it's got plastic tablecloths and lampshades that are covered in plastics, and that the condiments in the restaurants are wrapped in plastic. And even the waitress had a plastic wipe off like apron kind of thing. I just thought that was hilarious. But he didn't really think plastics was such a good idea. And then he starts to be philosophical about it, saying that he feels separated from the natural world. As he describes the plastic covers on his glasses in its room, and a sign on the toilet seat says it's been sterilized for his protection. And then, like an old man, he starts to say, "What's everybody trying to protect me for?" I just thought that was great.
He was pretty good at grumpy. He definitely was a grumpy old man. Yeah.
He was. He really was grumpy. And I wrote the heading on, some of my notes is his old man ideas about things, that he spent a lot of time sort of complaining about changes and growth and things that aren't like what they used to be, which he himself said was a preoccupation of the old, complaining about the new. And he just continued to keep doing it. And I have one note here about checking into a hotel in Seattle to get Charley. Remember when Charley got sick and he had to go see a vet? He comments on changes that he notices. He said, I began to experience a tendency I am perhaps too old to accept. It's the principle of do it yourself. At check-in in a hotel, there are no bellboys. There are no waiters. At breakfast, you make your own toast. The chambermaids creep in and out visibly. If I want ice and there's a machine down the hall, I have to get my own ice, my own newspaper. Everything's convenient, centrally located, and lonely.
One of the transitions that he does make reference to this is that was happening in the country at the time was what he's describing where everything's plastic and everything is self-serve. What there used to be hotels, and that was it. But then when the highway system came in the 50s, so that people were traveling in their cars a lot, we got motor hotels, which we now call motels. And the motels were basically do it yourself. They were stripped down to the extent, you're lucky if there was somebody in the lobby when you got there to check in. But what his life had become, he was wealthy, he was famous, he lived in New York City, he traveled around as a wealthy, famous person. So he went to Paris and stayed in nice hotels in Paris. He mentioned the hotels in New Orleans and in other places where he had stayed, where somebody comes out to your car and takes your bags in, and the bellboy or bellhop, I don't know what they call them, bellhops, well, that's interesting. So the word bellhop comes from somebody rings a bell and you better hop. I've always wondered what that word meant. Now I know. So there's a contrast there between the life of America in 1960, mobile, on the road, highways, not the back roads of his childhood, where every road really was a back road.
Well, what I was thinking about the part where he goes back to Salinas and the surrounding area, and I thought that was a very oldish experience of going, especially if you haven't been back home and around surrounding area, and you go back and you have an image in your mind of what it looked like when you were growing up. And then you see, he described in detail, the roads were different. There were so many big roads and so many different stores. And I do have a quote here where he says, you can't go home again because home has ceased to exist except in the mothballs of memory.
Yeah, it's a great quote.
So I was like, our memory.
It is.
Is that a great quote? He is an amazing writer, I have to say.
Yeah.
If anybody wanted to know.
Yeah, I agree. All the reminiscing about going back to Salinas and going back up to, I think he talked about something he called it his attic days in San Francisco. I'm not sure what he meant by that, but I could only imagine it was like he was poor he was young. He was on an adventure. He didn't have much money to spend on anything. He was just sleeping in wherever he could sleep and having an adventure in San Francisco. And then he talked about how he still felt in awe of the hills of San Francisco when he returned, and the bright lights and the Golden Gate Bridge. And he goes on to wax sort of nostalgic over the Monterey Peninsula and Carmel and how much they've changed from his time when he was a boy, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then he climbed up Fremont's Peak, which overlooked the Salinas Valley. And he was telling Charley all about the things that he did as a boy. Which, yeah, I thought that was really kind of interesting. Stories from his childhood. I liked that part. Then there were some interesting statistics as well, too, because he was talking about how the roads used to be really narrow in Salinas, and there were wood teams that moved along through the woods with mules. I thought that was kind of interesting. With a little town, a general store, a blacksmith shop with a bench to sit and listen to the clang of the hammer. No, that's a lovely image, isn't it? And then he goes on and on about like the mobile homes, like how in California, they were spawning like herrings.
I don't think he was a fan.
No, he was definitely not a fan.
No.
Although, interestingly enough, though, earlier in the book, when he was talking about, the first time he was talking about the mobile homes was in New York State, I think, where he spent some time with a family who was living in a mobile home. And he went on about, you can pick up and move and bring your home with you. The family that he stayed with the guy was a mechanic. And his dream was to set up his mechanic shop in one of these mobile home communities and people would just bring their cars to him. And if the business dried up there, he could move to another mobile home community and be a mechanic there. But by the time he got all the way out to California, the mobile home was like a plague. It was, just everywhere and horrible. So he kind of went through that process of, oh, here's something nice and new and modern. And, oh, man. But, by the time he got out to California, he hated it.
Yeah. He was not happy about, he was talking about the population in Salinas when he was there was only about 4,000 citizens or something. And then at the time of this book was written, it was up in 1962, it was up to 80,000. I'm sorry, in 1962 it was about 4,000 citizens. And then by 2021, it was up to 80,000. And now it's 163,000. I looked up the statistics of how much growth there's been going on out there in Salinas, the county. Yeah.
So I think it's such an oldish theme, that we have a sense of what home looks like, what it felt like, what it smelled like, what it sounded like. And then we go back in our oldest years. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about, I grew up outside of Albany, New York, and I was thinking about all the changes that happened along the way and the big highways that replaced the streets and roads that connected the suburbs to the city, and just so many things that gentrifying parts of Albany at that time. There were just so many changes. As an oldish person, it's like, okay, well, like you said, it's just there in my memory. It's not there anymore.
Well, before we run out of time today, I do want to, it seems like a very sensitive subject, but he spent quite a bit of time at the end of the book talking about racism in the South. Up until he got out to California and then turned east, in some ways he was doing his reverse life track, because he started off poor in Salinas and ended up wealthy in New York. And so on this trip, he ended up, going from New York back across the northern part of the country to California and down into Texas, where he had spent quite a bit of time. His wife was from Texas, and so he stayed with friends from Texas. And he talked about the wealth gap. He talked about how rich people how they dressed and acted and so on, like super wealthy people. But then he headed into the South. And before he did that, in the book, he talked about his trepidation for going into the South because he was aware that the culture was different there, and he was actually nervous about it, I think. So he went to New Orleans first, is the first place that he talked about in the South. He went to New Orleans, and it sounded to me as though he had been in New Orleans quite a bit in the past and knew about Bourbon Street and, had friends there and so on, but that he chose not to visit. But there was a school desegregation thing going on when he was passing through. And he made a point of going to observe that and spent the next, 40, 50 pages in shock about what he had seen and describing the culture and that was around that. How did you two feel about reading that part of it?
Well, as a kid, I don't remember the cheerleaders. I mean, he talked a lot about the cheerleaders, and I thought that he was specifically going to see these women demonstrating against the integration of the schools. I found that to be kind of interesting and also very disturbing, but again, something that was happening in the times. I also was a little bit surprised at his fascination with it. He really got into describing the cheerleaders a lot, and what was going on there. These were mothers who were protesting the integration of the schools and children.
One of my thoughts is that what that he modeled in this book from an oldest perspective to have an interest, an awareness and an interest in what's going on right now and wanting to understand it. I also felt, just as a reader, so discouraged that what was going on then is going on now. And I was thinking of prominent political people right now who are acting just like those cheerleaders. One of the parts of that section that really touched me was when he picked up two different men of color, two different Black men. The one who was just it sounded like so traumatized by being around white people and just assumed the worst. And that person just had to ask to get out of the car. He couldn't even sit there with John Steinbeck. And then the other one who was younger, more sounded like almost like wanted to be in the Black Panther or was already, I don't know if the Black Panthers had been created yet. They might not have. But anyway, so that I thought that was very touching and certainly opened up a part of himself in this book that other parts of his experiences didn't seem to touch on.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting juxtaposition between fear in the older man and hopefulness in the young man about the future. I like that he included those two different characters, that he picked those two people up to give him a ride.
And in between those two characters, he picked up a white guy. And the white guy was so nasty, he stopped the truck and
that was
threw him out of the
great.
truck.
Did either of you feel that way as far as parts of that someone could have written that right now?
Yeah, it's still happening.
Yeah.
Like, for example, like that guy who the writer who was white and was going on about how horrible people of color are. And then when John Steinbeck didn't agree with him, instead of it, I didn't feel like John Steinbeck wrote like, he had been kind of egging him on. It didn't feel that way to me. I felt like he was just kind of responding, John Steinbeck, asking questions as an outsider. And then this guy immediately turned on him and said, "Oh, you're one of those people from the North." And I thought it's interesting, like jumping to being so defensive as opposed to, having a conversation. And that seems so true today.
One of the things I wonder about there, though, is stereotypes. I don't like stereotyping anybody. And the people in the South that he described fit neatly into a stereotype that I have. And I have to say that I lived in Louisiana for several months one time when I was working in the oil fields. And that was in the 70s. It hadn't improved any by then. And the stereotypes, I ran into a lot of those stereotypes. I was actually fairly low on the social, I don't want to say totem pole because that's racist too, but I was fairly low in the social hierarchy there because I was a Yankee college boy, and I got a lot. I ended up actually making a pretty good friend who was a black guy that I worked with because the people that we worked with thought it would be funny to put us together and leave us alone on an oil platform overnight, just the two of us. And the two lowest people on the hierarchy that they could think of, wouldn't it be funny to just put them together and abandon them? So I got to see that stereotype up close, and maybe someday I'll tell you some of the other things that I saw. But the part of the actual hatred that he describes or shows us, it's one of the things that I like about his writing is that he doesn't describe things. He shows them to you. He's so good at the making things real with words that it's like, here, look at this.
Okay,
And
so
it's gotta go,
let
right?
me wrap up a little bit. Before we end this discussion, I do want to say something about Steinbeck's comments on being American, because the subtitle of this story is In Search of America. And I'm not so sure it was conclusive in terms of his writing about that. I mean, on his return journey back, after he's turning around and coming back, he starts to ruminate on what it means to be an American. I found this a pretty confusing part of the book when I was hoping that it was going to be, very philosophical and interesting. But what he says confused me. He says something about what it means to be American in all the vastness of the land that he just traveled through, He settles on some idea about each person and each immigrant that travels the same route that he took across America, which I think is true, is going to have a different experience from his experience. And their experience is going to be different from each other. Yet he says each is alike in their Americanness. Now, I don't know what you make of that, but I said, wait a minute, what?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just was left thinking about it. I thought, I wonder if that's true. And I wonder if for all of our differences and diversity, as far as the parts of the country and just who we all are, is there something to that? I don't know. I was left with just, I don't know.
Yeah, me too. But I mean, he wonders about it. And towards the end, it makes a little sense when he says something like, and I do believe this is true of Americans. He says, could it be that Americans are a restless people? Yes. Never satisfied with where they are? Yes. And that the pioneers and the immigrants, the people who came here to live, were the restless ones in Europe and wherever they came from. And then the steady rooted ones stayed home. They didn't come to America. They stayed in Europe or wherever they lived, So I thought that was interesting. But this whole idea that,
that's
great.
great. Well,
What about you, Greg? How do you weigh in on?
Well, I read it actually a couple of times because it was like, what? And I think that part of his point is that, so if you ask the question, is there an America represented by Americans? And I think that his point is, yes, there is that America. You can find that America, but it's made up of individuals who are who are themselves and Americans.
thank you, Leslie Ross-Degnan, for joining us in our ongoing series of book reviews. I think our next book is The Little Old Lady Who Broke All the Rules.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie.
Well, this was fun. I really enjoyed having this conversation about Steinbeck in a book I haven't read for decades, since I was youngish. And now I'm oldish. I had a whole different perspective on it. I think we all did. And I think it was really interesting to share our insights. So if you haven't read it, read it again. You can have some insights too. on the wonderful and amazing John Steinbeck. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. It was great having you on again. I second your suggestion there that I read it when I was 12, and what I recalled all the years was the travel log and not the sense of the man that comes through. And I think now that I'm an oldish man myself, I can relate more to the sense of the man that came through there. It was a great opportunity to revisit that thing of my childhood. And I read it when I was 12, and I remembered it the whole time. As I was reading through it again, I was like, oh yeah, I remember this part. Folks, if you haven't read it in a long time, go read it. If you've never read it before, put it on your list. Remarkable writer, great story. Charley's a pretty good dog.
Yeah, I liked Charley too.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Greg.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Leslie for joining us again and bringing her oldish voice to our conversations about books. Our next book will be The Little Old Lady Who Broke All the Rules. Our next episode will be our second in our new series, Shortish. The topic will be the dinking game, which will sound familiar if you are a pickleball player, but will have meaning even if you are not. Stay tuned. You can leave comments or requests for topics or guests on this or other episodes at www.oldish.me. If you like what you heard today, please tell a friend and rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.